Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you are watching from tonight, and please do not forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. Your presence here means everything, and together we are building something special in these quiet hours when the world slows down. Now, settle in, get comfortable, perhaps adjust your pillow. Let the weight of your day drift away like morning fog over the bayou as we travel together to a place wrapped in mystery, thick with humidity, and alive with spirits that refuse to be silenced no matter how hard the powerful try to destroy them. Imagine a summer night in 1962. The air hangs heavy over New Orleans, carrying the scent of jasmine and night-blooming flowers mixed with something else, something older. From somewhere in the French Quarter, jazz drifts on the humid breeze. Tourists wander Bourbon Street, drawn by neon lights and the promise of excess. But if you were to leave those well-lit streets, if you were to wander past the tourist areas into the back neighborhoods where live oak trees drip with Spanish moss and houses lean together like old friends sharing secrets, you might hear something different entirely. A rhythm, drums. Not the polished percussion of a nightclub band, but something more primal, something that was supposed to have died decades ago. In a small house in the Tremay neighborhood, hidden from the eyes of outsiders behind closed shutters and drawn curtains, a group of people gather around an altar decorated with candles, fresh flowers, bottles of rum, and the images of Catholic saints. A woman in white leads them in prayer. But something in the way they move, in the songs they sing in a language mixing French and African words, belongs to a world far older than Christianity. They are practicing voodoo. And they are doing so in secret because the forces that nearly destroyed their faith entirely are still fresh in living memory. Tonight, I want to tell you the story of how New Orleans voodoo survived against impossible odds. Not the Hollywood version with evil dolls and curses and zombie armies rising from swamps. That version is a fantasy created by people who never understood what they were looking at. No, I want to tell you the real story, which is far more fascinating and far more tragic than any horror film. This is the story of enslaved people who carried their gods across an ocean of suffering, hiding them in their hearts when everything else was stripped away. This is the story of a hairdresser who became the most powerful woman in her city simply by listening to the secrets that wealthy clients whispered while she styled their hair. This is the story of how a living faith was crushed by law, by shame, by deliberate erasure over generations, and how somehow, against all odds and expectations, it refused to die completely. This is the history they never taught you in school. The history buried beneath tourist shops and souvenir dolls and sensationalized television shows. The history that still whispers from Congo Square on Sunday afternoons, if only you know how to listen. Close your eyes and let me take you there. Our journey begins not in New Orleans, but thousands of miles away on the western coast of Africa, in lands that European slave traders would come to call the Slave Coast. Picture a time before the horror of the transatlantic slave trade, when great civilizations flourished along the rivers and coastlines of West and Central Africa. In the kingdom of Dahomey, in the lands of the Yoruba people, in the vast Congo and Angola regions, spiritual traditions had evolved over countless centuries. These were not the primitive superstitions that European colonizers would later claim in order to justify their cruelties. They were sophisticated, complex systems of belief that addressed every aspect of human existence. The people of these regions understood something that Western Christianity had largely forgotten, that the visible world is only half of existence. Alongside it lies another realm, the spirit world, populated by powerful entities that can influence every aspect of daily life. There were spirits of rivers who controlled the fish that fed entire communities, spirits of forests who must be appeased before trees could be harvested, spirits of diseases who could bring sickness or take it away, spirits of love who could unite hearts or tear them apart, spirits of commerce, of fertility, of war, of death. These spirits were not distant like the God of Christianity, too grand to concern themselves with individual human problems. They were intimate, present, actively engaged in the affairs of the living, and specially trained priests and priestesses served as intermediaries between the human world and the spirit world, learning from childhood the sacred knowledge necessary to communicate with these powerful beings. These religious specialists knew which songs to sing to attract particular spirits. They knew which offerings would please them and which would cause offense. They knew the herbs that healed and the herbs that harmed. They knew how to read the future in the patterns of thrown shells, in the behavior of animals, in the shapes of clouds. This was not superstition. This was a comprehensive spiritual technology developed over millennia. And then the ships came. I will not dwell long on the horrors of the Middle Passage, for its cruelties are beyond what words can adequately capture. Millions of human beings were torn from their families, packed into the suffocating holds of ships, and transported across an ocean that became a graveyard for countless souls who never reached the other shore. But I want you to understand this. The men, women, and children packed into those ships were not merely bodies being transported for labor. They were people carrying entire worlds in their memories, songs their grandmothers taught them, prayers whispered in languages the slavers could not understand, knowledge of which plants healed fever and which could stop a heart, complex philosophical systems for understanding the nature of existence, and most importantly, the unshakable belief that the spirits traveled with them across the water. The slave traders could chain their bodies, they could take away their names and their families and their freedom. But they could not reach into the minds of the enslaved and extract the sacred knowledge stored there. They could not stop the spirits from following their children across the ocean. The first enslaved Africans arrived in French Louisiana in 1719. Just 1 year after the founding of New Orleans itself. The French had established a peculiar colony here, built on swampland, that seemed determined to swallow everything humans tried to construct upon it. The Mississippi River flooded regularly. The mosquitoes brought diseases that killed Europeans by the hundreds. The Native American peoples of the region, the Choctaw, the Natchez, the Houma, had their own complex relationships with the spirit world that the French barely understood. The colony was desperately short of labor. The swamps needed to be drained. The levees needed to be built. The sugarcane that would become Louisiana's most profitable crop needed to be planted, cultivated, and harvested under a brutal sun. And so the French looked to Africa. The enslaved Africans who arrived in Louisiana came primarily from the Senegambia region and from Congo, Angola. They were not chosen randomly. The French specifically sought people from regions known for rice cultivation, whose expertise would prove invaluable in the marshy terrain of Louisiana. But the slavers could not be selective about what knowledge their captives carried in their minds. Along with agricultural expertise came spiritual traditions that would refuse to be extinguished. Louisiana under French rule was different from the English colonies to the north and east. The French were Catholic, and their approach to slavery, while still brutal, had different characteristics than the Protestant English system. The Code Noir, the Black Code established in 1724, mandated that all enslaved people be baptized and instructed in the Roman Catholic faith. Enslaved people were required to be given Sundays off from labor and were not permitted to be worked on Catholic holidays. This requirement for Catholic instruction was intended as a tool of control, a way of stripping African people of their cultural identities and replacing them with European religion. But something unexpected happened instead. The French, unlike the English, were accustomed to dealing with African populations in their Caribbean colonies, where African religious practices had already begun blending with Catholicism. They were perhaps less paranoid about cultural expression than the Protestants. They permitted enslaved people to gather on Sundays, their one day of rest. They did not immediately recognize what was developing in these gatherings. In the mixing of Catholic imagery with African belief, something new began to emerge. something that would eventually be called voodoo. The spirits of African religion found new faces in the Catholic saints that the French were so insistent on teaching about. This was not mere substitution, not simply calling an African spirit by a saint's name while secretly continuing unchanged practices. It was something far more creative and sophisticated. Consider the spirit known as Legba. In Dahomey, Legba was the guardian of the crossroads, the divine intermediary who must be addressed before any other spirit could be contacted. He controlled the boundary between the human world and the spirit world. When African practitioners in Louisiana learned about St. Peter, who holds the keys to heaven's gates, who determines who may enter the divine presence, they recognized something familiar. The two figures merged in their understanding, with Legba St. Peter becoming the essential spirit to invoke at the beginning of any ceremony. Similarly, Airzeli, the spirit of love and beauty and feminine power, found a natural parallel in the Virgin Mary, the compassionate mother who intercedes for human beings with higher powers. The snake spirit Grand Zombie, associated with creation and transformation, merged with Moses, who turned his staff into a serpent before Pharaoh. Throughout the developing Louisiana voodoo tradition, African and Catholic elements wove together into something genuinely new. This syncretic process, this blending of traditions, is sometimes misunderstood as religious hypocrisy or deception. It was neither. The enslaved practitioners genuinely recognized something in Catholicism that resonated with their African understanding of the spirit world. They incorporated what made sense to them, while preserving what they could not abandon. The result was a faith uniquely suited to the New World, and then the Haitian Revolution changed everything. In 1791, the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue, the French colony that would become Haiti, rose up against their masters in what would become the largest and most successful slave revolt in human history. The stories of how it began are surrounded by legend, but many accounts connect the revolution to a voodoo ceremony. They say it was August of 1791, at a place called Bourg Cayman, when a group of enslaved people gathered in secret. A priestess named Cécile Fatiman, possessed by the warrior spirit Ogu, called upon the Laveau to bless the uprising. Lightning flashed, thunder rolled, a black pig was sacrificed and its blood distributed among those present, sealing their oath to fight. Within days, the plantations of the northern province were ablaze. Whether or not the specific details of this origin story are accurate, the connection between African spirituality and resistance was unmistakable. The revolutionaries believed the spirits were with them, and after 13 years of brutal warfare, they won. Haiti became the second nation in the Western Hemisphere to achieve independence, and the first black republic in the world. But victory in Haiti created upheaval that rippled across the Caribbean. Thousands of refugees fled Saint-Domingue, including both white planters and enslaved workers, free people of color, and those still in bondage. They went to Cuba, to Jamaica, and in significant numbers to Louisiana. When restrictions on migration from Haiti briefly lifted around 1809, another wave of refugees arrived in New Orleans. These Haitian newcomers brought with them a more developed and systematized form of voodoo than what had been developing independently in Louisiana. They brought specific rituals, specific songs, specific hierarchies of spirits. They brought knowledge that had been refined through generations of practice in the Caribbean. And their arrival supercharged the spiritual practices already brewing in the Crescent City. The population of New Orleans nearly doubled. The French-speaking culture of the city was reinforced against the growing tide of English-speaking Americans arriving after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, and a faith that had been developing in fragments and variations began to coalesce into something more unified. By the early 1800s, New Orleans had something found nowhere else in North America, a place where African drumming, dancing, and religious expression happened openly, regularly, and more or less legally, at least on Sunday afternoons. They called it Congo Square. The place we now know as Congo Square sits at the edge of the French Quarter, just across Rampart Street in what was once called the back of town. It is a modest plot of land today, paved over and surrounded by Louis Armstrong Park. Tourists sometimes wander through on their way to somewhere else, barely pausing to read the historical markers. They have no idea they are standing on sacred ground. Before the French arrived, this land was special to the Huma people. They gathered here for corn harvest ceremonies, giving thanks for the abundance that sustained their community. The earth itself had been a meeting place for spiritual purposes long before any European ship appeared on the horizon. Under French and then Spanish rule, the space became a gathering place for enslaved Africans. What began as simple markets evolved into something far more significant. On Sunday afternoons, their only time of rest, hundreds and eventually thousands of people would gather in this open field. Picture the scene. Free people of color, their status tenuous but real, mingled with enslaved workers who had walked for hours from distant plantations. Some came to buy and sell goods, carefully saving money coin by coin toward the eventual purchase of their freedom. Others came to see family members owned by different masters, to share news, to maintain the bonds that slavery was designed to destroy. But most of all, they came for the music. The instruments were like nothing European observers had seen. Drums made from hollowed logs and barrels covered with animal skin stretched tight, stringed instruments fashioned from gourds, ancestors of the banjo, rattles made from dried gourds filled with seeds, jawbones of horses and mules whose teeth would rattle when struck, bells and chimes tied to dancers' ankles, and voices, dozens and then hundreds of voices, raised in songs that blended African languages with French Creole, creating something entirely new. The architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe visited New Orleans in 1819 and recorded his impressions in his journal. His account, while marred by the prejudices of his era, provides one of the most detailed descriptions of Congo Square in its heyday. Latrobe described walking to the back of town on a Sunday afternoon and finding 500 or 600 people assembled. The crowd was predominantly black, both enslaved and free, but white observers gathered at the edges to watch the spectacle. In the center of the crowd, drummers surrounded by dancers created a scene that Latrobe found both fascinating and disturbing. He described drums of different sizes and constructions, some made from wooden cylinders covered with sheepskin, others from logs carved hollow. The drummers beat complex, interlocking rhythms that seemed chaotic to his untrained ear but were in fact carefully coordinated. Around them, dancers moved in ways that shocked European sensibilities, their hips swaying, their bodies bending in ways that proper Victorian ladies would never permit themselves. Latrobe called the scene savage. He could not appreciate what he was actually witnessing. But even through his condescension, the power of what was happening in Congo Square comes through. This was not mere entertainment. This was worship dressed as celebration, religion disguised as recreation. The dances had names. The bambula, perhaps the most famous, featured a drum made from a barrel covered with animal skin. Its driving rhythm became so synonymous with New Orleans that you can still hear echoes of it today in jazz funeral processions and Mardi Gras Indian parades. The kalinda was a couple's dance that authorities considered scandalously intimate. The Congo involved circular movements and call and response singing. The carabine and the juba each had their own specific steps and spiritual significance. To the uninformed observer, these were simply exotic entertainments. To the participants, they were so much more. Specific rhythms called specific spirits. Specific songs honored specific ancestors. The movements of the dance were not random expressions of joy, but deliberate ritual actions designed to open the boundary between the human world and the spirit realm. And something else was happening in Congo Square that the authorities never fully understood. Information was being shared. News was being passed from plantation to plantation through the gathering. Family connections severed by sale were being maintained. Resistance was being organized quietly, carefully, under the cover of seeming celebration. The drums themselves could carry messages that overseers could not decode. In other southern colonies and states, African drumming had been explicitly banned. The slaveholders there understood, perhaps better than modern observers, that the drums were dangerous. They carried meanings that could not be controlled. They reinforced connections to Africa that the institution of slavery was designed to sever. They reminded enslaved people that they came from great civilizations, that they had culture and religion and dignity that no bill of sale could truly destroy. But in New Orleans, for reasons that historians still debate, the drums were permitted to beat, and in that permission, something precious was preserved that was destroyed almost everywhere else in North America. The gatherings in Congo Square were not constant throughout the antebellum period. They ebbed and flowed with the political winds. Under French rule, they were relatively unrestricted. Under Spanish rule, some regulations appeared. After the Louisiana Purchase, when American authorities took control of the territory, suspicion of African gatherings increased. In 1817, the newly American city issued an ordinance that restricted all gatherings of enslaved people to one location, Congo Square, which at the time was officially called Place Publique. This might seem like a legitimization of the Sunday gatherings, and in some ways it was, but it was also a step toward control. The authorities wanted to know where the gatherings were happening. They wanted to be able to monitor them. They wanted to contain what they were beginning to fear. The celebrations continued through the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, though increasingly under the watchful eye of police and suspicious citizens. White observers came in growing numbers, some genuinely curious, others looking for evidence of sinister activities. Newspaper reporters wrote sensationalized accounts of what they claimed to witness, describing voodoo rituals and suggesting dark purposes behind the dancing. By the 1850s, the restrictions were tightening further. White writers expressed alarm about the mixing of races at the ceremonies, particularly the presence of white women at gatherings where black men danced. The specter of miscegenation, of intimate contact between races, horrified the white establishment more than any supposed supernatural threat. And then, in 1856, the final blow fell. A city ordinance made it illegal to beat a drum or blow a horn in public. The drums of Congo Square fell silent. But understand this: the spirits did not leave. The faith did not die. The gatherings simply moved, retreating into private spaces where authorities could not easily follow, into the back rooms of houses, into the swamps and bayous outside city limits, into places known only to those who needed to know. And at the center of this increasingly underground movement stood a woman whose name would become legend, whose shadow would extend across nearly a century of New Orleans history, whose tomb would become a place of pilgrimage that continues to this day. Let me tell you about Marie Laveau. She was born in September of 1801. Though some historical records suggest it might have been a few years earlier. The uncertainty is appropriate for a woman who would spend her life wrapped in mystery. The records of free people of color in early New Orleans were haphazardly kept, and much about Marie Laveau's origins remained subject to debate. What we know for certain is that she was born free in the French Quarter of New Orleans to a mother named Marguerite d'Arcantel, who was herself a free woman of color descended from enslaved Africans and French colonists. Marie was the first of her maternal line to be born into freedom, rather than winning it through manumission or purchase. Some accounts say her grandmother had been a powerful priestess in Haiti before the Revolution, that the knowledge of the spirits had passed through the generations like an inheritance more valuable than any property. Others say she learned the old ways from elders in the New Orleans community, from the men and women who had brought African traditions through the Middle Passage and preserved them through decades of slavery. Either way, by her early 30s, Marie Laveau had become the most influential spiritual figure in the city, a status she would maintain for over 6 decades. Her day job was hairdresser. This might sound mundane, even humble, but consider what this occupation meant in early 19th century New Orleans. Marie Laveau styled the hair of wealthy white women, the wives of politicians, businessmen, plantation owners, men who wielded power over the lives of thousands, and these women talked while Marie worked her combs and pins through their elaborate coiffures. They complained about their husbands' mistresses, they worried about their children's marriages, they gossiped about scandals within their social circles, they revealed business dealings that their husbands thought were secret. Marie Laveau listened to everything and forgot nothing. Meanwhile, her black clients, many of whom worked as domestic servants in those same wealthy households, told her what happened behind closed doors. The business dealings their masters discussed over dinner, the illicit relationships conducted in upstairs bedrooms, the financial troubles hidden behind facades of prosperity, the schemes and corruptions that fueled New Orleans society. Information flowed to Marie Laveau from every direction. She became, perhaps, the best informed person in New Orleans, and she used this information with remarkable skill. When wealthy clients came to her for spiritual consultations, seeking insight into their futures or solutions to their problems, Marie Laveau often already knew the answers before they finished asking the questions. But she was far more than a gatherer of gossip. Marie Laveau was a devout Catholic who attended daily Mass at St. Louis Cathedral, that grand church facing Jackson Square that remains the heart of Catholic New Orleans to this day. She prayed the rosary. She went to confession. She raised her many children in the faith. And she also presided over voodoo ceremonies in her home on St. Anne Street and led the famous St. John's Eve celebrations on the shores of Lake Pontchartrain. She saw no contradiction in this dual practice. Why would she? The spirits she served had long since learned to wear the faces of saints. The same forces that answered her voodoo rituals answered her Catholic prayers. To Marie Laveau, these were not separate religions but different doorways into the same spiritual reality. Her home at 152 St. Anne Street, long since demolished, became a destination for people of every race and social class. The wealthy came seeking advice about investments and business ventures, willing to pay handsomely for the insight they believed she could provide. Young women came hoping for help finding husbands or keeping the husbands they had. The sick came seeking cures for ailments that doctors could not treat. Criminals came hoping to escape justice. The innocent came hoping to prove their innocence. And Marie Laveau helped them all in one way or another. Sometimes her help involved prayers, both Catholic and African. Sometimes it involved gris-gris, the charms and amulets that practitioners created from specific combinations of herbs, roots, bones, feathers, and other objects. A gris-gris bag worn next to the skin could protect against evil, attract love, bring success in business, or accomplish dozens of other purposes depending on its contents and the rituals performed over it. Sometimes Marie Laveau's help was more practical than supernatural. Armed with her vast knowledge of the city's secrets, she could provide information that changed the outcome of court cases, business negotiations, and romantic entanglements. Some historians suggest that her reputation for magic was built substantially on her skills as an intelligence gatherer and manipulator of information, but the people who sought her help believed in something more than mere information. They believed in her power to intercede with forces beyond the visible world. And whether that belief was justified or not, it made Marie Laveau extraordinarily powerful. Her most public ceremonies were the St. John's Eve celebrations held annually on June 23rd. St. John's Eve, the night before the feast of St. John the Baptist, was traditionally a time of celebration across Catholic Europe, marking the summer solstice with bonfires and festivals. In New Orleans, under Marie Laveau's leadership, it became something more. Thousands of people would gather on the shores of Lake Pontchartrain. Bonfires blazed along the beach. Drums that could not be played in the city proper thundered into the night. Dancers moved around the fires in rituals that blended African traditions with European folk practices. At the center of it all stood Marie Laveau dressed in white, calling down the spirits while police officers and newspaper reporters watched from the edges of the crowd. uncertain how to respond to something they could not control. The authorities knew about Marie Laveau. They could hardly avoid knowing. Her name appeared in newspapers. Her ceremonies were public events. Her home was famous throughout the city. Police occasionally raided her gatherings, arresting participants on charges of disturbing the peace or practicing illegal gatherings. But somehow, Marie Laveau always escaped serious consequences. Perhaps her network of information gave her leverage over people in power who could not afford to have their secrets exposed. Perhaps her charitable works, nursing the sick during the yellow fever epidemics that periodically devastated the city and feeding the poor from her own kitchen, earned her protectors among the elite. Perhaps the authorities simply feared what might happen if they pushed too hard against someone so beloved by the city's black population. In 1850, another voodoo practitioner, a woman whose name has been lost to history, attempted to challenge Marie Laveau's authority. The challenge failed, though the details of how are murky. For the next 3 decades, until her death in 1881, Marie Laveau remained the undisputed queen of New Orleans Voodoo. But here is what the sensationalized accounts of her life almost always miss. Marie Laveau was not a wicked sorceress or a manipulative fraud. She was a woman who used every tool available to her, spiritual and practical alike, to serve her community and protect her people in a society that was designed to crush them. She visited condemned prisoners in their cells, praying with them in their final hours before execution. She prepared meals for the poor and hungry. She nursed yellow fever victims when most people fled the city in terror, putting her own life at risk to care for the sick and dying. She helped bury children, both white and black, when families could not afford funerals. She gave shelter to the homeless and advice to the desperate. When she died in June of 1881, just a few months short of her 80th birthday, the newspapers of New Orleans printed long obituaries. The New York Times reported on the passing of the famous voodoo queen. Most accounts described her as a woman of great beauty, intellect, and charity who had dedicated her life to helping others. Some could not resist calling her a fraud and an arrant sinner, of course. The contradictions that surrounded her in life followed her to the grave. Her funeral was held at St. Louis Cathedral, the same church where she had worshipped daily for decades. She was buried in a family tomb in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, where pilgrims still visit today, leaving offerings and prayers and sometimes marking 3 X's on the tomb in hope that the Queen will grant their wishes from beyond the grave. But with Marie Laveau's death, the golden age of New Orleans voodoo came to an end. Some say her daughter, also named Marie, continued her mother's work. The historical confusion between mother and daughter has never been fully untangled. The younger Marie was reportedly more theatrical than her mother, more focused on public ceremonies and dramatic displays. Some scholars believe that many of the most sensational accounts of Marie Laveau's activities actually describe the daughter, not the mother. We may never know for certain. What is certain is that after the elder Marie Laveau's death, New Orleans voodoo began a long, painful decline toward near extinction. The forces arrayed against the faith were overwhelming, and they grew stronger as the 19th century progressed into the 20th. After the Civil War ended slavery, white authorities became even more determined to control the black population through other means. The brief hope of Reconstruction, when black men voted and held office and black communities began to build wealth and institutions, gave way to the nightmare of Jim Crow. New laws explicitly designed to maintain white supremacy were passed and brutally enforced. Segregation became the law of the land. In this environment, anything that connected black Americans to Africa, anything that suggested their cultures were valuable and their traditions worth preserving, became a target. Voodoo ceremonies were raided and participants arrested on charges of fraud, disturbing the peace, practicing fortune-telling without a license, and whatever other charges authorities could devise. The legal system that had supposedly freed the enslaved was now used to persecute their spiritual practices, but the legal persecution was only part of the assault on voodoo. Perhaps more damaging in the long run were the campaigns of shame and stigma. Newspapers published sensationalized accounts portraying voodoo ceremonies as primitive, depraved, and dangerous. White writers like George Washington Cable and Lafcadio Hearn wrote descriptions that simultaneously fascinated and horrified white readers. Their accounts emphasized everything that seemed threatening to white society: the mixing of races at ceremonies, the prominent role of women in positions of spiritual authority, the African elements that could not be tamed by Christian propriety, the suggestion of sexuality in the dances. For the white supremacists consolidating power in the post-Reconstruction South, voodoo became evidence of black inferiority. "Look," they said, "at these savage practices. Look at how these people dance and drum and call upon African gods. Clearly they are not fit for citizenship, for education, for equality." Voodoo was weaponized against the very communities that practiced it. Faced with this assault from multiple directions, many black New Orleanians made a survival choice. They stopped practicing openly. They stopped acknowledging their beliefs to outsiders. Mothers hesitated to teach their daughters the old ways, afraid of what might happen if their children were caught participating in illegal ceremonies, or if word got out that their family was involved with voodoo. The knowledge that had been passed down for generations began to fragment and fade. Specific rituals were forgotten. The meanings of certain songs were lost. The careful training that had produced skilled practitioners like Marie Laveau simply stopped happening as the teachers died without passing on their knowledge. By the early 20th century, scholars attempting to document voodoo found it almost impossible to locate active practitioners. Those who still practiced did so in such deep secrecy that they would never admit their beliefs to an outsider. The faith had gone so far underground that, from the surface, it appeared to have vanished entirely. The great folklorist Zora Neale Hurston traveled to New Orleans in the 1920s and 30s, seeking to document voodoo practices for her research. Hurston was black herself and deeply sympathetic to the tradition, but even she found it difficult to gain access. The practitioners who remained had learned through bitter experience that outsiders could not be trusted, that any acknowledgement of belief could bring legal trouble, social stigma, or both. Hurston eventually did find teachers willing to share some knowledge with her, and her accounts of voodoo initiation are among the most vivid we have from this period. But she herself noted that what she was learning was fragmentary, that the full tradition was no longer being transmitted, even among those who still practiced. Too much had been lost. The historian Carolyn Morrow Long, who would spend years studying the tradition, concluded that by 1940, voodoo as an organized religion had been thoroughly suppressed by the legal system, public opinion, and Christianity. The complete knowledge, the systematic training, the unbroken chain of transmission from priestess to apprentice that had characterized the tradition in Marie Laveau's day had been severed. Think about what that means. Imagine if the Catholic Church had been suppressed so thoroughly that by 1940 there were no functioning parishes, no trained priests, only a few elderly people who remembered attending Mass as children, and some shops that still sold rosaries and holy cards. That is approximately what happened to New Orleans voodoo. The suppression was that complete, the erasure was that thorough. And yet somehow, impossibly, something survived. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, the Federal Writers Project, a New Deal program that employed writers during the Great Depression, sent field workers to interview elderly black New Orleanians about their memories of voodoo. These interviews were a race against time, and the field workers knew it. The people being interviewed had been young when Marie Laveau was still alive. They remembered the ceremonies of the 1870s and 1880s, the last era when voodoo was practiced openly. But they were in their 70s and 80s themselves, and their memories were fading. The interviews conducted during this project are preserved in archives today, and reading them is a bittersweet experience. Here are the last people who remembered voodoo as a living, public tradition, speaking to interviewers who were trying desperately to capture their knowledge before it was lost forever. One elderly woman described attending ceremonies as a child, brought by her mother to gatherings in back rooms and bayou clearings. She remembered the sound of the drums, the flickering of candles, the sense of something powerful present in the room. She remembered specific prayers and songs, though by the time of the interview she could only recall fragments. She remembered the respect that people showed to the voodoo queens, the way ordinary folk would lower their eyes and speak softly in their presence. Another interviewee, a man in his 80s, had worked as a servant in a wealthy household during the years just after the Civil War. He described seeing gris-gris bags hidden in the corners of rooms, placed there by fellow servants seeking protection or advantage. He talked about the fear that white people felt toward voodoo, a fear that seemed to him out of proportion to anything the practitioners actually did. "They were scared of us," he told the interviewer, "though we never did them any harm." A third person remembered Marie Laveau herself, seen from a distance at a St. John's Eve celebration. She was old by then, the interviewee said, but she still had a power about her. When she walked into a room, everyone knew. When she spoke, everyone listened. This interviewee could not say whether Marie Laveau had genuine supernatural abilities or simply the accumulated authority of decades of leadership, but the distinction did not seem to matter much. These interviews provide tantalizing glimpses of what had been lost. The interviewees described altars and ceremonies, gris-gris and healing practices, the social structures that had organized the voodoo community. But even they could provide only fragmentary accounts. They had been children during the last years of public practice, and children do not understand everything they witness. The adults who could have explained more fully were long dead, having taken their knowledge to the grave. The Federal Writers Project interviews were published decades later as part of broader collections of African American folklore. Scholars have mined them for insights into the historical practice of voodoo, but no amount of scholarly analysis can resurrect what was lost when the suppression succeeded in breaking the chain of transmission from one generation to the next. What remained after the suppression were fragments. Hoodoo, the magical practices stripped of their religious context, survived in drugstores and botanicas throughout the French Quarter and beyond. You could still buy candles for specific purposes, love potions and protection powders, gris-gris bags and blessed oils. People still left offerings at Marie Laveau's tomb, but the living religion that had flourished for a century and a half had been driven to the edge of extinction. And then came the 1960s, a decade that would change everything. The civil rights movement arrived in New Orleans with the force of a hurricane, challenging the segregation that had strangled black communities for generations. Young people, tired of their parents' accommodation to injustice, took to the streets demanding change. In September of 1960, 7 students from local black universities staged a sit-in at the Woolworth's department store on Canal Street, protesting the lunch counter that would serve white customers but refused to serve them. Police arrested them. The next day, more students came. The protests spread to other stores, other streets, other cities. Boycotts targeted businesses that refused to hire black workers or serve black customers. On the commercial corridors where black New Orleanians had been shopping for generations while being treated as second-class citizens, the economic power of the community was finally deployed as a weapon. Stores that refused to change saw their revenues collapse. And then came school integration. In November of 1960, 4 little girls became heroes simply by walking through schoolhouse doors. Ruby Bridges, just 6 years old, walked into William Frantz Elementary School past crowds of screaming white protesters who hurled threats and slurs at a child barely old enough to read. Leona Tate, Tessie Prevost, and Gail Etienne entered McDonough No. 19 under similar conditions. Federal marshals escorted them, but no one could protect them from the hatred in the eyes of the mobs. At Dookie Chase's restaurant in the Treme neighborhood, civil rights leaders gathered to strategize over bowls of gumbo. The restaurant, owned by a black family since 1939, had become a safe space where activists could meet and plan. The legendary chef Leah Chase welcomed anyone fighting for justice to her tables, regardless of race, at a time when such mixed gatherings were technically illegal. Thurgood Marshall sat in that restaurant planning legal strategies. Martin Luther King Jr. made plans there. The local leaders who organized boycotts and voter registration drives and protests used Dookie Chase as their unofficial headquarters, and in serving them, in creating a space where the movement could breathe and think and grow, Leah Chase became a civil rights hero in her own right. Something remarkable began to happen to perceptions of African American culture during this tumultuous decade. The same traditions that had been demonized for generations started to be recognized as valuable heritage, deserving of preservation and respect. Jazz, which had been born in part from those Congo Square gatherings and had been dismissed by respectable society for decades, was now being celebrated as America's classical music. New Orleans musicians who had once played in disreputable establishments were being recognized as masters of an art form unique to this nation. The Mardi Gras Indians, whose elaborate handmade suits and songs of defiance carried on traditions blending African resistance with Native American alliance, became objects of fascination rather than targets of police harassment. Their annual celebrations, long confined to black neighborhoods away from the tourist parades, began to attract wider attention and respect. And voodoo, that most vilified of African American spiritual traditions, began to transform in the public imagination. The change was not entirely positive, but it represented a shift that would have profound consequences. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, dominant American culture had viewed voodoo primarily as sinful and threatening. The ceremonies were described as devil worship, as black magic, as evidence of dangerous savagery requiring suppression. From the turn of the century until about the 1960s, the official view shifted slightly. Voodoo was seen less as genuine supernatural threat and more as fraud, as charlatans taking advantage of ignorant victims who needed to be protected from their own gullibility. But by the latter half of the 20th century, both the sin framework and the fraud framework were giving way to something new. Voodoo was increasingly viewed as entertainment, as a tourist commodity, as a potential gold mine for commercial exploitation. This transformation was a double-edged sword with consequences that continue to reverberate today. On one hand, the shift away from active persecution allowed practitioners to emerge from hiding for the first time in generations. People who had kept their faith entirely private for decades could now at least acknowledge their beliefs without facing immediate arrest. A new generation, inspired by the Black Power movement's embrace of African heritage and the broader cultural reassessment of African American traditions, began seeking out the old ways that their parents and grandparents had been forced to abandon. On the other hand, the commercialization that accompanied this cultural revival threatened to strip voodoo of its authentic spiritual content entirely. Souvenir shops began selling mass-produced voodoo dolls, a concept that had little to do with actual practice. In authentic voodoo tradition, dolls were not used to harm people by sticking pins into them, as Hollywood had portrayed for decades. They were used in healing rituals to direct positive energy towards someone in need. But explaining this nuance was not good for sales, so the stereotype persisted and multiplied across thousands of cheap souvenirs. Tour guides led groups through the French Quarter, spinning sensationalized tales of curses and zombies and midnight orgies. The tours passed Marie Laveau's former home, her tomb, Congo Square, weaving together fragments of truth with generous helpings of fiction to create an entertaining narrative that bore little resemblance to the actual religion being described. The Hollywood version of voodoo, always more fiction than fact, became even more dominant in the popular mind. Films portrayed voodoo practitioners as evil sorcerers or primitive savages, perpetuating stereotypes that harmed both the faith and the communities that practiced it. Meanwhile, the black neighborhoods where voodoo had actually been practiced faced devastating changes that had nothing to do with spirituality and everything to do with urban politics. In 1968, after years of planning and construction, Interstate 10 was completed through the heart of New Orleans. The highway's path through the city had been bitterly contested. Preservationists had fought successfully to keep the elevated roadway from cutting through the French Quarter, whose historic architecture was deemed worthy of protection. But no such protection was offered to the Treme neighborhood. The interstate sliced through Claiborne Avenue, once the central artery of Black New Orleans. Rows of magnificent live oak trees, hundreds of years old, were cut down to make way for concrete pillars. The vibrant commercial corridor where black businesses had thrived for generations was severed in two. The neutral ground where families had gathered for picnics and communities had celebrated Mardi Gras was buried under shadow. The Treme, which had been home to free people of color since before the Civil War, which contained Congo Square itself, which had nurtured jazz and voodoo and so many other elements of Black New Orleans culture, was permanently scarred. Property values collapsed, businesses closed, families who had lived there for generations moved away. The social networks that had sustained community for centuries were torn apart. There is a particular cruelty in what happened to Claiborne Avenue that deserves to be fully understood. Before the interstate came, this was no ordinary street. The neutral ground, the grassy median that runs down the center of many New Orleans boulevards, was lined with massive live oak trees, some of them hundreds of years old. Their branches intertwined overhead, creating a canopy that shaded the entire avenue. On weekends and holidays, black families would gather under those oaks. Children would play while adults talked and laughed. Food vendors would set up along the sidewalks. During Mardi Gras season, this was where the black community had its own celebrations, separate from the white parades on St. Charles Avenue, but just as joyous and even more meaningful. The Mardi Gras Indians would gather on Claiborne, their handmade suits representing months of painstaking work, their songs connecting to traditions that reached back to the alliances between escaped slaves and Native American tribes. The second-line parades would wind through these streets, brass bands playing while everyone who could hear the music joined the procession. This was the heart of Black New Orleans, the place where community was not just maintained but celebrated. And then the federal government, in its wisdom, decided to build a highway through it. The decision was not inevitable. The original plans for Interstate 10 would have taken it along the riverfront, through the French Quarter. The white establishment mobilized immediately to protect their tourist district. Preservationists made impassioned arguments about historical architecture and cultural heritage. The plans were changed. But when those same preservationists were asked whether the highway should be routed through the Treme instead, destroying the heart of Black New Orleans, their silence was deafening. The historical architecture of black neighborhoods did not merit protection. The cultural heritage of black communities could be bulldozed without comment. The live oaks of Claiborne Avenue were not considered worth saving. Today, if you walk under the interstate where Claiborne Avenue used to be, you will see concrete pillars where those magnificent trees once stood. The shadows are harsh and gray instead of dappled and green. The ground is oil-stained asphalt instead of grass where children played. The community that gathered here has been scattered, many of them never to return. This is what was happening to Black New Orleans in the same years that voodoo was being rediscovered as a tourist attraction. The contradiction is almost too painful to contemplate. White visitors came to the city seeking exotic experiences, buying voodoo dolls and taking ghost tours, while the actual black communities that had created New Orleans culture were being systematically destroyed. And to add insult to injury, city officials renamed Congo Square. Starting at some point in the late 19th century, the sacred ground where enslaved Africans had kept their culture alive was officially designated Beauregard Square, a general who had fought to preserve slavery in the Confederate Army. This renaming was part of the broader lost cause mythology that erected Confederate monuments throughout the South. The same people who claimed to celebrate New Orleans' unique heritage were systematically erasing the African American contributions to that heritage, while elevating those who had fought to keep black people enslaved. The irony was bitter and unmistakable. Tourists flocked to New Orleans to experience what they imagined to be authentic voodoo culture, spending money on tours and souvenirs and trinkets, while the actual communities that had created that culture were being displaced, bulldozed, and erased. And yet, through all of this, the spirits survived. The 1970s brought something new, a deliberate, conscious revival of voodoo as a living spiritual tradition, rather than a mere historical curiosity or tourist attraction. In 1972, a man named Charles Gandolfo opened the New Orleans Historic Voodoo Museum in the heart of the French Quarter. The museum was a peculiar institution from the beginning, part tourist attraction, part educational resource, part gathering place for practitioners both authentic and aspiring. The space was small and cluttered with artifacts, altars, and images that ranged from genuinely significant to deliberately kitsch. Visitors could learn about the history of voodoo in New Orleans, view ritual objects, and, if they wished, receive readings or consultations from practitioners who worked there. The line between education and entertainment, between authentic tradition and tourist performance, was deliberately blurred. Gandolfo himself was not a voodoo practitioner, but someone fascinated by the tradition who saw an opportunity to preserve and share it while also making a living. His museum became a gathering point where serious students of the faith could connect with teachers, where tourists could have their curiosity satisfied or stimulated, and where the tradition itself could maintain a public presence in a rapidly changing city. 2 years before the museum opened in 1970, the first New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival had been held at Congo Square. This was more than a music festival, though the music was extraordinary. It was a deliberate attempt to honor the heritage of the place, to acknowledge that the rhythms played on those stages had roots in the Sunday gatherings of 2 centuries before. The Jazz Fest, as it became known, would grow over the decades into one of the largest music festivals in the world. It eventually outgrew Congo Square and moved to the Fairgrounds racecourse, but its origins in that sacred space were never forgotten. Every year, the festival brings hundreds of thousands of people to New Orleans specifically to celebrate the African-American musical traditions that the city had nearly destroyed. A new generation of voodoo practitioners emerged during this period, many of them trained not in the fragmentary New Orleans tradition that had barely survived suppression, but in related African diaspora religions that had survived more intact elsewhere. Some traveled to Haiti to study voodoo there, receiving initiations and training that had continued in an unbroken line despite the economic and political upheavals that nation had endured. The knowledge they brought back was not identical to what had been practiced in New Orleans in Marie Laveau's time, but it was related, growing from the same African roots and carrying similar spiritual content. Others studied Cuban Santeria, another African diaspora tradition that had preserved more of its structure than New Orleans voodoo had managed. Still others traveled to West Africa itself to study Vodun at its source, being initiated in temples in Benin and Nigeria where the traditions had never been interrupted by slavery or suppression. These returning practitioners faced difficult questions about authenticity and continuity. Were they reconstructing historical New Orleans voodoo or creating something new? Did it matter? Was a tradition brought back from Haiti or Cuba or Africa genuinely the same as what Marie Laveau had practiced? Or was it something different wearing the same name? Different practitioners answered these questions differently. Some emphasized continuity, claiming that the spirits themselves were the true source of authority and that the spirits recognized those who genuinely served them regardless of where they had received their training. Others acknowledged the reconstructive nature of their work, arguing that adaptation had always been at the heart of voodoo and that the tradition had been evolving continuously since the first enslaved Africans reached Louisiana. The tension between authentic practice and commercial exploitation persisted and even intensified. Some practitioners operated in both worlds, performing ceremonies and consultations for serious clients while also selling tourist-friendly items in shops decorated with spooky imagery. Others drew strict lines, refusing to participate in anything that smacked of commercialization and practicing only in private settings among those who shared their faith. The larger question of who had the right to practice voodoo at all became increasingly complicated. White New Orleanians and tourists began seeking initiation into traditions that had developed specifically within black communities as a response to oppression. Some practitioners welcomed anyone who approached with genuine respect and willingness to learn. Others saw this as another form of cultural appropriation, as white people taking one more thing that black communities had created. These debates continue today, and I will not pretend to resolve them. What I can tell you is that despite all the complications and controversies, the 1970s and 80s saw a genuine revival of interest in voodoo as a living spiritual path rather than a historical curiosity. People who would never have acknowledged such beliefs publicly a generation earlier began openly identifying as practitioners. Temples and spiritual houses opened their doors, some welcoming tourists and others remaining resolutely private. And then the flood came, threatening to destroy in hours what suppression had failed to eliminate in generations. In August of 2005, Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast with devastating force. The storm itself was terrible, but the real catastrophe came when the levees that protected New Orleans failed. Water poured into the city from Lake Pontchartrain and the Mississippi River. 80% of New Orleans flooded. Nearly 2,000 people died. The images that flashed across television screens horrified the world. Families stranded on rooftops waiting for rescue that took days to come. Bodies floating in the floodwaters. The Louisiana Superdome transformed into a nightmare of desperation and despair. The richest nation on earth seemed unable or unwilling to rescue its own citizens, and the communities that had preserved African American culture through centuries of oppression were among the hardest hit. The lower Ninth Ward, a working-class black neighborhood that had produced countless jazz musicians and cultural traditions, was virtually destroyed. The Treme, already wounded by the interstate, was heavily damaged. Across the city, black neighborhoods that had survived slavery and Jim Crow and urban renewal were swallowed by the waters. The displacement was almost incomprehensible. Hundreds of thousands of people fled the city, many with nothing but the clothes they wore. They scattered to Houston, to Atlanta, to cities across the country. Families that had lived in New Orleans for generations found themselves in strange places with no money, no possessions, and no certainty of ever returning home. For the voodoo community, the hurricane was another episode in a long history of catastrophes that had somehow been survived. Practitioners who had maintained altars in their homes for generations were displaced, their sacred objects destroyed or abandoned in the rush to escape. The informal networks through which knowledge was passed down, the relationships between teachers and students, the communities that gathered for ceremonies and celebrations, were disrupted and scattered. Before Katrina, researchers had estimated that perhaps 2,500 to 3,000 voodoo practitioners lived in New Orleans. After the storm, by some counts, that number dropped to fewer than 300, but just as the spirits had survived legal persecution and social stigma and deliberate erasure over generations, they survived the hurricane too. In the years since Katrina, the recovery has been slow but steady. Some displaced practitioners returned, determined to rebuild not just their homes but their spiritual communities. They salvaged what they could from flooded houses, reconstructed altars, reconnected with fellow believers who had also made their way back. New practitioners emerged, some drawn to the tradition by the very experience of catastrophe and survival, finding in voodoo a framework for understanding suffering and resilience. Congo Square was officially restored to its historical name in 2011, removing the Confederate general's designation that had stood as an insult for over a century. The change was part of a broader reckoning with the Confederate monuments and lost cause mythology that had shaped public space throughout the South. Every Sunday afternoon, if you walk to Louis Armstrong Park and find your way to the paved square with its historical markers and its ring of oak trees, you may hear drums. The Congo Square Preservation Society, led by drummer Luther Gray, hosts regular drum circles that echo the gatherings of 200 years ago. The rhythms played there are not identical to what Benjamin Latrobe heard in 1819, of course. How could they be, when so much knowledge was lost in the decades of suppression? But they carry something of the same spirit, the same defiant joy, the same insistence that what was meant to be destroyed will somehow survive. The Voodoo spiritual temple continues to operate across the street from Congo Square, offering ceremonies, consultations, and education to those who seek them. Founded by Priestess Miriam and her husband Priest Oswan Chamani, the temple has served as a center for the community for decades. Other houses of worship, less visible to tourists, maintain their own practices in private spaces throughout the city. At Marie Laveau's tomb in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, offerings continue to appear no matter how often the caretakers clear them away. Candles and flowers, coins and beads, handwritten prayers asking for the Queen's intercession. The practice of marking 3 X's on the tomb, once common, has been discouraged due to the damage it causes to the historic structure, but visitors still come in a constant stream, seeking something the tourist shops cannot sell them. And here is what the tourists never see. In homes throughout New Orleans, in modest houses and apartments where no visitors are permitted, people maintain altars to the Loire. They pour libations to their ancestors each morning, offering coffee or rum or water as their particular spirits prefer. They light candles and burn incense and sing the old songs, or as close to the old songs as they can reconstruct. They observe the feast days of the Catholic saints who wear the faces of African spirits, cooking particular foods and performing particular rituals as the traditions require. Some of these practitioners learned the ways from their grandmothers, inheriting knowledge that survived the suppression by passing from generation to generation in whispered conversations and private ceremonies. Others came to the tradition later in life, seeking connection to a spiritual heritage that called to them through books and museums and chance encounters. All of them share a commitment to keeping alive something that powerful forces tried very hard to destroy. They do not advertise. They do not charge admission. They do not pose for photographs or perform for tourists or sell their beliefs for souvenir prices. They simply practice their faith, as their spiritual ancestors have done for 3 centuries, in quiet defiance of every force that tried to kill it. This is the true story of New Orleans Voodoo. Not curses and zombies and dolls stuck with pins. Not midnight orgies and blood sacrifices and pacts with the devil. Those images were created by people who feared what they did not understand, who had every reason to demonize the spiritual practices of people they were oppressing. The true story is of a living religion brought across an ocean by people in chains who refused to let their captors take everything from them, a faith that blended and adapted and evolved, finding in Catholicism not a replacement for African belief, but a complement to it, a tradition that was beaten down again and again, by law, by shame, by flood, and refused to die completely. The spirits that enslaved Africans called upon in the suffocating holds of slave ships still receive offerings in 21st century New Orleans. The rhythms that echoed through Congo Square when hundreds of enslaved people gathered on Sunday afternoons still pulse through the city's music. The knowledge that Marie Laveau accumulated through her network of informants and wielded with such skill still passes, in altered forms, from initiate to initiate. They tried to erase this faith. They tried to make it disappear through laws that forbade its practice, and newspapers that mocked its believers, and cultural forces that taught practitioners to be ashamed of their own traditions. They tried to turn it into nothing more than a tourist attraction, a shell of commercial stereotypes with no spiritual content remaining. They failed. Some things cannot be killed, no matter how hard you try. As you drift toward sleep tonight, I want to leave you with one final image. Imagine Congo Square on a Sunday afternoon in the present day, casting long shadows across the ground that was sacred to the Huma people before any European arrived, that bore witness to the dances of the enslaved when nothing else in America would permit such gatherings, that heard the drums fall silent under suppression and then heard them begin again decades later. A circle of drummers sits at the edge of the square, pounding out rhythms that have traveled through centuries and across oceans to reach this moment. The bambula beat sounds, and if you close your eyes, you can almost imagine you are hearing what Benjamin Latrobe heard 200 years ago. A few tourists watch from the edges, snapping photos for their social media feeds, but in the center of the gathering among the dancers and the drummers, you might see something else if you looked carefully. You might see someone moving not just to the rhythm, but with the rhythm. Eyes half closed, swaying to music that only they can fully hear. You might see a stillness come over their face, a quality of presence that suggests someone else is looking out through their eyes. If you believe what the practitioners believe, you might understand that in that moment, something ancient and powerful has crossed over from one world to another. A Lurwa has arrived, a spirit called by the drums and the offerings and the faith of those who refuse to let the old ways die. A presence that has watched over this ground for longer than anyone now living can remember, that has seen the gatherings of the enslaved, and the suppression and the rebuilding and the hurricanes and the rebuilding again. The spirits are still here. They were here before the French founded their struggling colony on swampland that should have swallowed it. They survived the crossing from Africa that killed so many of their children. They survived slavery and Jim Crow and erasure and commercialization. They survived the waters that rose in 2005 to drown the city that was their home. They will be here long after we are gone. And if you ever find yourself in New Orleans, walking through the French Quarter on a humid evening, when the jazz drifts from doorways and the scent of the river mingles with jasmine and cooking food, remember what you have learned tonight. Remember that beneath the tourist surface, beneath the souvenir shops and the sensational tours and the cheap plastic voodoo dolls, something ancient and genuine survives. The spirits are watching. They always have been. They always will be. Before I let you go, let me share a few more stories from this remarkable tradition that I think you deserve to hear. There was a man they called Dr. John, though that was not his given name. He was born in Senegal, on the western coast of Africa, and was kidnapped into slavery as a young man. He survived the Middle Passage, that nightmare voyage across the Atlantic, and found himself eventually in Cuba, working in conditions that would break most spirits. But Dr. John's spirit was not easily broken. He managed somehow to buy his freedom, a feat requiring extraordinary luck and determination, and made his way to New Orleans, where he worked as a cotton roller on the docks. It was honest labor, hard and physical, but it gave him access to the port where ships arrived from all over the world. In his free time, Dr. John established himself as a healer and spiritual advisor. His reputation grew until people throughout New Orleans, black and white alike, sought his counsel. He was said to have the gift of foresight, to be able to see what others could not. Some came to him for healing, bringing ailments that doctors could not cure. Others came seeking advice about love or business or family troubles. And it was Dr. John who became one of Marie Laveau's most important teachers, the man from Senegal who had survived enslavement and crossed an ocean passed on his knowledge to the woman who would become the most famous voodoo queen in American history. The chain of transmission connecting New Orleans to West Africa was direct and unbroken, at least for that generation. We do not know exactly what he taught her. We do not know which rituals came from his Senegalese heritage, which were adapted from his time in Cuba, which developed during his years in New Orleans. But we know that when Marie Laveau rose to prominence, she acknowledged Dr. John as one of those who had shown her the way. In honoring her teachers, she was honoring Africa itself. There were other teachers too. Sanité Dede, a woman whose name suggests she came from the Caribbean, was one of the first publicly recognized voodoo leaders in New Orleans. She held ceremonies in the early 1800s, before Marie Laveau had reached adulthood. Some say she initiated Marie into the deeper mysteries of the tradition. Marie Salopé was another powerful figure, a rival who at times challenged Sanité Dede's authority. The politics among the early voodoo queens were complex and are mostly lost to history now. What we know is that women held positions of spiritual leadership in voodoo at a time when women in most American religions were expected to remain silent and submit to male authority. This centrality of women in voodoo was both a strength and a vulnerability. It was a strength because it gave women a sphere of power and influence in a society that denied them most others. It was a vulnerability because it made voodoo doubly threatening to the white establishment. Not only were black people preserving African traditions, but black women were leading them. In the patriarchal culture of 19th century America, this was nearly as scandalous as the African elements themselves. The newspapers of the time could barely contain their horror at the prospect of women wielding spiritual power. Their accounts drip with condescension and disgust. They described the voodoo queens as manipulative frauds at best, as devil worshippers at worst. The respect that people in the black community showed to women like Marie Laveau was treated as evidence of how degraded and backwards that community supposedly was. But the respect continued nonetheless. People continued to seek Marie Laveau's counsel. They continued to attend her ceremonies. They continued to leave offerings at her tomb for over a century after her death. The newspapers could write whatever they wished. The community knew what it knew. Let me tell you about the St. John's Eve celebrations in more detail, for they were perhaps the most spectacular public expressions of New Orleans voodoo. June 23rd was a night of power. The summer solstice had just passed, and the days had begun their slow shortening toward winter. In the old European traditions, this was a time when the boundary between worlds grew thin, when the spirits walked more freely among the living, when magic was most potent. Marie Laveau recognized the power of this date and claimed it for her tradition. In the years of her leadership, the St. John's Eve celebrations on the shores of Lake Pontchartrain became legendary events that drew thousands of participants and observers. Picture the scene as witnesses described it: the sun setting over the lake, painting the water in shades of orange and red. Bonfires being lit along the shore, their flames dancing in the humid air, drummers beginning their rhythms as the darkness deepened, the beats traveling across the water to be heard for miles. And in the center of it all, Marie Laveau herself, dressed in white, her tignon, the traditional head wrap of free women of color, adorned with feathers and beads. She would wade into the shallows of the lake, calling upon the spirits, leading her followers in prayers that blended Catholic invocations with African ones. Some say she would emerge from the water with a snake wrapped around her shoulders, the serpent spirit Grand Zombie made manifest. The ceremonies continued through the night. People danced until they could dance no more. Some were possessed by the spirits, their bodies becoming vessels for forces greater than themselves. Offerings were made to the Laveau, food and drink, candles and flowers, the blood of chickens sacrificed in the ancient manner. And at the edges of the celebration, white observers watched with a mixture of fascination and horror. Newspaper reporters took notes, preparing the sensationalized accounts they would publish for readers hungry for lurid details. Police officers monitored the crowd, ready to intervene if the celebration seemed to threaten public order. But year after year, the celebrations continued. Marie Laveau had made herself too powerful to suppress easily. Her network of information, her connections to both the black community and to powerful white allies, her reputation for genuine spiritual insight, all combined to give her a kind of immunity that few black New Orleanians enjoyed. The St. John's Eve celebrations did not survive her. After her death in 1881, the gatherings at Lake Pontchartrain faded away. Later, practitioners attempted to revive them, but the magic of those nights when thousands gathered under Marie Laveau's leadership could not be recaptured. I want to speak also about the material culture of New Orleans voodoo, the physical objects that practitioners used in their work. The gris-gris was perhaps the most important of these objects. The word itself likely comes from the Mande languages of West Africa, where similar objects were used for protection and blessing. In New Orleans, a gris-gris was typically a small bag containing a carefully selected combination of ingredients, Herbs, roots, bones, feathers, stones, small written prayers, and other items whose specific composition was closely guarded. Different gree-gris served different purposes. A gree-gris for love might contain rose petals, honey, and items associated with the target of affection. A gree-gris for protection might include black salt, iron filings, and graveyard dirt. A gree-gris for success in business might hold bay leaves, cinnamon, and coins. The exact recipes were passed from teacher to student, modified and personalized over generations. The process of creating a gris-gris was itself a ritual. The ingredients had to be gathered at specific times, with specific prayers. The bag had to be sewn in a particular way, often by the light of a specific candle. Once completed, the gris-gris had to be activated through ceremony before it would hold power, and the user had to care for it properly, feeding it with periodic offerings of perfume or alcohol, keeping it close to the body where it could do its work. Beyond gris-gris, practitioners used a wide range of other objects. Candles of different colors served different purposes: white for purification, red for love, green for prosperity, black for protection or more aggressive workings. Oils and perfumes, each with their own spiritual associations, were applied to candles, to gris-gris, to the bodies of practitioners preparing for ceremony. Images of Catholic saints were everywhere in voodoo practice, but they were understood in particular ways. A statue of Saint Peter guarding the door of a house was also Legba keeping watch at the crossroads. A holy card of the Virgin Mary on an altar was also Erzeli receiving offerings of perfume and sweet cakes. The Catholic imagery was not a disguise but a genuine dimension of the syncretic faith. Altars themselves were crucial to practice. A voodoo altar might contain candles, offerings of food and drink, images of saints and photographs of ancestors, objects sacred to particular spirits, flowers, and numerous other items. The altar was a point of contact between the human world and the spirit world, a place where offerings could be made and where the presence of the Laveau could be felt. Much of this material culture survived the suppression of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, preserved in the hoodoo drugstores and botanicas that continued operating even when public ceremonies had ceased. You could not hold a ceremony, but you could still buy a candle. You could not openly identify as a voodoo practitioner, but you could still obtain the herbs and oils needed for traditional workings. This material continuity was important. Even when the knowledge of how to use the objects was fragmenting and fading, the objects themselves remained available. When the revival began in the 1960s and 70s, practitioners did not have to reinvent everything from scratch. The raw materials of the tradition were still there, waiting to be taken up again. And now, let me speak of something rarely discussed in accounts of New Orleans Voodoo: its relationship to resistance and liberation. The spirits that enslaved Africans brought with them were not neutral forces. They had ethics, preferences, opinions about how human beings should treat one another, and the spirits did not approve of slavery. This is important to understand. When enslaved people practiced voodoo, they were not merely preserving cultural traditions for their own sake. They were maintaining connection to powers that affirmed their humanity at a time when the entire structure of society was designed to deny it. They were accessing resources of strength, courage, and hope that helped them survive conditions designed to destroy them. Some practitioners used their knowledge directly in service of liberation. Root doctors provided medicines and charms to people planning escapes. Divination was used to identify when the spirits favored action. Curses were worked against particularly cruel slaveholders and overseers. The tradition that the white establishment dismissed as primitive superstition was actually a form of spiritual warfare waged against the institution of slavery itself. The Haitian Revolution, which sent so many Vodou practitioners to New Orleans, was understood throughout the African diaspora as proof that the spirits favored freedom. If enslaved people in Saint-Domingue could overthrow their masters and establish a black republic, perhaps enslaved people elsewhere could do the same. The fear that haunted slaveholders throughout the American South was informed in part by what had happened in Haiti, and the spiritual traditions associated with that revolution were feared accordingly. This is one reason why the suppression of voodoo was so relentless after the Civil War. The white establishment understood, perhaps dimly but persistently, that voodoo was not merely an exotic religious practice but a resource for black resistance. Destroying the faith was part of the larger project of maintaining white supremacy after the legal institution of slavery had ended. But the spirits could not be legislated out of existence. The faith could not be arrested and imprisoned. What could be done, and what was done, was to drive the tradition so far underground that it nearly vanished entirely. The miracle is that it did not vanish completely. In every generation there were those who remembered. Grandmothers who whispered the old prayers to grandchildren they trusted. Practitioners who continued their work in absolute secrecy, never admitting to anyone outside their immediate circle what they believed and practiced. Fragments of knowledge preserved in songs, in stories, in family traditions whose origins were half forgotten. And when the time came for revival, when the 1960s and 70s brought both opportunity and hunger for connection to African heritage, something remained to be revived. The tradition that the authorities had tried so hard to kill proved to have roots too deep to be entirely destroyed. I think often about what was lost. The complete ritual knowledge that Marie Laveau possessed, the songs and ceremonies and techniques that she learned from Dr. John and Sanate Dede and the other elders who trained her, the understanding of specific spirits, their preferences and personalities and relationships to one another, that allowed practitioners to work with them effectively. The herbal knowledge, the healing traditions, the divination systems, all refined over generations and then lost in a few decades of suppression. We cannot recover what was lost. The practitioners who might have passed on that knowledge died without doing so, either because they had no one to teach or because they feared the consequences. The unbroken chain of transmission that had stretched back to Africa was broken, and while new chains have been forged, they are not quite the same. But I also think about what survived: the determination, the faith, the absolute refusal to let the powerful have the final word about what matters and what does not. The spirits themselves, who according to practitioners never abandoned their children no matter how dire the circumstances became. New Orleans voodoo today is not identical to what Marie Laveau practiced. It could not be. Too much was lost. Too much has been added. Too much has changed in the world around it, but it is continuous with what she practiced. It grows from the same roots, honors the same spirits, serves the same communities, and that, in the end, is the story. Not a story of destruction, though destruction features heavily, not a story of survival, though survival is its constant theme, but a story of transformation, of a faith that has changed and changed again while remaining somehow itself. The spirits are patient. They have seen empires rise and fall. They have watched their children suffer and endure and somehow persist. They will be watching long after the last tourist has left the French Quarter and the last souvenir shop has closed its doors. Sleep well, dear friends. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If this journey through the hidden history of New Orleans voodoo moved you, please consider sharing it with others who might appreciate learning what really happened to this remarkable faith. Hit the like button if you found value in this story. Subscribe if you have not already, and leave a comment telling me what hidden history you would like to explore together next. There are so many stories still to tell. So many places where the official version hides something more complex and more human beneath its surface. So many spirits waiting to have their stories heard. Until next time, may your rest be peaceful, your dreams be kind, and your nights be filled with the gentle rhythm of distant drums, playing songs that no force on earth could ever fully silence. Good night.